Hello, I'm David Marcher, and welcome to Land of Confusion podcast. I haven't done one of these in a while, and maybe we'll be doing more in the future. But this is my friend Dan Flaherty, and he's had a bunch of questions on the Ukraine war. And I have 28 years of amateur military historian experience, as well as some ties to the deep state. Uh, so I'm happy to answer any questions you have, Dan. So why don't you start?
Okay, well, first off, thanks a lot for having me on, David. I was asking those questions, for the audience that may not know, we know each other through Rich Barris, the People's Pundit, and his book club, completely open to the public every Sunday. And
Hmm.
David, you're one of many people on there that just, when I have foreign policy questions running through my head, I'm like, I got to ask the crew on Sunday what's going on. Because
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, and regarding the Russia-Ukraine war, I guess I'm deeply concerned that there's just simply going to be a war between Russia and Europe. Even with Trump, I thankfully we have a president now trying to get us out rather than
Yeah.
entrenching us in at this point. But when you see the reactions in Europe to the Trump Zelensky kerfuffle at the Oval Office, and just in general, what seemed I'm going to use the phrase delusion, but I don't know that that's really accurate to
Hmm.
describe the leadership. Starmer in London, Macron in Paris. I'm forgetting the name of the leader of the EU right now,
Hmm.
but they all just seem to be, frankly, hell bent on just continuing this. And I guess, my thesis from the start, I'm hardly original in this, is that like this war in Ukraine is being fought to protect the money laundering operations of the West that go on through there. And as I think through that, I'm thinking like, okay, so let's say you're a horribly corrupt leader, of which there are plenty in the West. You've got this operation which you're making trillions of dollars. You will do anything, on God's green earth to hold on to that. And
Hmm.
certainly to prevent it from being exposed, which would happen if Ukraine falls and collapses. So the more I thought about it, I thought like they're never going to let this go because they can't. And that's why I think delusional is a mistake to say that if I'm right in that assumption, and if you look at it from their perspective, this, again, a very corrupt perspective, but it's, just because something's corrupt doesn't mean it's not rational, in its own
Yeah.
way, that it actually makes sense that they probably have greed mixed with just enough hubris to think that they can keep this war going, hold off Russia, contain it, prevent it from getting completely out of hand. But as a fallback, if it does get out of hand, well, hey, they have bunkers they can go hide in if the bombs really start going off, and their population doesn't. And so that's kind of my core thesis. And I'm hoping somebody can tell me that I'm overreacting. Is kind of the
No, I
gist
think
of
you're
it.
right. If you look at the bond markets for Europe, they have invested heavily into backing Ukraine. I think London's up like $600 billion of backing into Ukraine. So what we're seeing, unfortunately, it was kind of inevitable where the Ukrainians were going to run out of people because Russia has more.
Yeah.
Russia still maintains an industrial base, unlike, say, the United States. I would put Russia's industrial base somewhere around the United States in the 1970s.
Okay.
The Russians gained an artillery advantage last year. Well, they had it about 18 months ago, but it's been increasing, and they're at probably 10 to 1 artillery over the Ukrainians at this point.
Yeah.
And like, what do you think? The British have been supplying Storm Shadow missiles to the Ukrainians to fire at the Russian forces. What do you think the monthly uh, production rate of that would be?
I have no idea.
One. One a month. You're going to defeat Russia with missiles you can make one a month.
Are you kidding me? All right.
Nope.
This
Nope.
so even if Britain and France, of course, after the Trump Zelensky thing, my wife and I have talked because, like, our social media feeds, like most people's, just went crazy, and we know plenty of people that were, the I stand with Ukraine stuff was getting posted all over, and I'm kind of like thinking, like, because and somebody advocated, well, all of Europe should just get together and go take over Putin. But from what it sounds like you're saying is like, look, even if Britain and France, who are the primary, seem to be the primary drivers behind this aggression, even if they went all in, like they're still not producing enough that they're going to
Yeah, that's the
defeat
problem.
Russia.
We have we the essential thesis that I would propose is that outside of South Korea, the assumption was any war that lasted more than 3 months, we just assumed it was going to go nuclear. Or
Yeah,
it would be like Afghanistan, where you're doing low intensity conflict for decades. So that's the problem, is that we may base our entire military industrial complex about basically getting the people like Larry Johnson, who used to work for the CIA, once said, the military industrial complex of the United States is a welfare program for white people.
it's yeah.
You know,
And it's when you think about it, and we've talked about this on our Sunday club before
mm,
about how much the politics in the West in the United States have changed on this. Because I remember, Marjorie Taylor Greene once said, like, we don't want an economy that's built on blood.
yeah,
And Don Jr. said one of the something along those lines, and I thought like. When I was growing up in the '80s and then in college in the early '90s, that was something like the peaceniks, the
yeah,
liberal, all said, and we all kind of laughed at him. And it's funny. It's like I look back and think, like, we're basically saying you were right, and you're shouting at us and calling us fascists for saying you were right. I mean,
yeah.
it's like this is insane. It's
Yeah, is exactly what's happening. So people keep calling what's happening in Ukraine a stalemate. I have thoughts on that.
yeah.
It's
Please
not
share.
really a stalemate.
Okay, I don't think so either. I'm,
So, how familiar are you with your Civil War?
I would say like I probably have the basic level of familiarity. I mean, for my generation, which I think was reasonably good. So,
Yeah. So basically, the war starts. The commanding general in his 90s is Winfield Scott.
yes, I know that name. Yep.
Okay, yeah, and he's in his 90s, and he basically draws up a battle plan. Everyone, everyone who thought the war would be generally, everyone thinks the war is going to be over by Christmas, right? No one
Mm-hmm.
thinks it's going to take years to accomplish. But Winfield Scott basically draws up a war plan. He says, "Okay, we're going to blockade all the West Confederacy. We have the Navy; they don't. We're going to seize New Orleans, which they do. And
Mm-hmm.
aside from a few obscure battles in Colorado where the Union wins, the war is considered in stalemate for 4 years. Though there are McClellan basically, there's an obsession with taking Richmond because that is the center of the idea. It's the capital. It has most of the industry of the South is located in Richmond. So there's an obsession with taking Richmond for the first few years of the war. Finally, Grant gets put in charge in the West.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, no, the center of gravity is not Richmond. The center of gravity is Lee's army. And if we could defeat Lee's army, there will be no South. And I'm watching what's
Okay.
happening in the Ukraine, and that's the thing. The Russians know, people are complaining like, Kharkov is only 60 miles from the Russian border. Why haven't they taken it? And I'm like, because it's a massive drain on the Ukrainian resources to maintain a city like Kharkov. And
Oh,
then it would
yeah.
become economically part of Russia if they take it. But every bureaucrat, every soldier defending it has to be fed and paid to defend Kharkov. So the thing you do when you're in this kind of war is you defeat the enemy soldiers in the open fields or in the forests or
Okay.
whatever. And when the enemy army is defeated, you could take all the cities you want. And that's what we're watching in Ukraine. And the problem is so many, like I was watching Piers Morgan earlier this week, and they had this U.S. general on. And generals, I found a lot of these American people. First off, I think all of the American generals are probably the most politicized army since Mussolini in the 30s.
Really? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, they are. all just looking for their next federal contract. It's very Kelsey Grammer in the Pentagon Wars.
Okay. Boy, that's
Yeah, so that
well, that explains a lot with the
yeah,
results we've seen. So yeah.
and I've been a amateur. I've been a war gamer, played a lot of games, and my some of my friends said, Dave, you could probably defeat most American officers in a war game. And I'm like, well, that's one reason is because they don't play war games. They command armored divisions and stuff. But he's also like, yeah, but also the fact is that you could, as a player of a game, you can think outside the box. They have to follow their doctrine. And if they fuck up their doctrine, they'll be punished for it and won't get
Yeah.
promoted. And I was hoping to have Clark here. Clark Summers, me and Paul interviewed him, and I've interviewed him a few times on the Ukraine war, but he's on vacation. So,
Okay. Yeah. It's
yeah. But yeah, so that's what we're seeing in Ukraine is the fact that it's a war. I understand the initial Russian strategy is this: we're going to put pressure on the Ukrainians, show them we mean business. Zelensky initially settled down for talks, and they were actually making progress. Basically, what Putin wanted was a neutral Ukraine and the provinces of the West, where it was primarily Russian speakers, to basically become Ukrainian Quebec.
hmm That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
And then Boris Johnson shows up, tells him Zelensky, hey, we'll give you unlimited support. We could totally beat the Russians. And the war kicks off. And then when Johnson is kicked out of prime minister 6 to 9 months later, he goes to Raytheon and gets paid $5 million for speaking.
oh,
So,
did he really? Okay. So
yeah.
yeah,
So he
it
got,
all comes together eventually
yeah,
here for these
he got
guys. Yeah.
his payoff. So,
Yeah. So following that thesis of yours that they're defeating the Ukrainian army in the open
hmm,
fields, akin to Grant in the Civil War.
hmm.
So what would we expect the ultimate Russian victory, which is going to happen, whether it's at the negotiating table or the battlefield? Like, what does it look like? Do like eventually just this army break and they move into these cities then?
That's what I think will happen eventually. It's taken longer than I thought, but World War I had a similar situation where most people would have thought they would have ended earlier, but the U.S. once again was providing a lot of aid. As I told Rich once, look, you had to intervene in World War I. The West owed you too much money.
Okay, that's
Like it
yeah.
was the equivalent of like I don't know, $2.5 trillion versus the Germans only used $69 million.
That once we had given all that aid to begin with,
Yeah, if you
yeah.
once you had to, the British and French and the Russians owed you too much money. You couldn't have not have entered that war.
It's interesting you reference World War One because, of course, yeah, I mean, as you know,
Hmm.
like the quote unquote the lessons of Munich are always thrown out every time this happens as a reason to justify why we have to go all out to stop. I thought, do we ever talk about the lessons of Sarajevo and what happens like when an ethnic conflict escalates and then you start pouring money into it and you get drawn in deeper and deeper and deeper and
Yeah,
then it explodes. It's
yeah. No, World War One. So we have so many weird factors happen in that war. I've studied it extensively. First off, Russia has been forced to back down twice now. And when the situation with Serbia explodes, they're on their third time. And they're like, we can't back down.
right.
Uh, we have to do something. So they mobilize. The Germans give the Austrians a blank check. The Austrians have one of the dumbest military plans I've seen in the history of mankind, and are nearly destroyed by Russia in the first year of the war. If the Russians hadn't decided to send troops to relieve France and Germany and East Prussia, they probably would have knocked Austria out of the war, and the war would have been over in 1915.
Yeah.
But they had to split their forces because of things. Also, the fact the Russians also had the complete Austrian battle plan because of an Austrian spy.
Well, and we know from the perspective of history now, too, they had a burgeoning communist rebellion that I'm sure didn't magically appear in 1917. There must have
The
been
British had been
something.
seeding that for years, and then suddenly they found themselves in a military alliance with Russia, and it's like, oh crap, We put in all this effort to try to overthrow their government, and now they're our ally. What the fuck do we do?
But one of the things you mentioned, regarding back to our current war, that you said like that you thought it is taking Russia longer than you thought, and one of the things that's been commented on is that like Putin seems to be acting with remarkable patience. Now,
Hmm.
critics would say it's because he can't take Ukraine. I mean, and of course we could go back and forth on that forever, but
Hmm.
I'm kind of the view that like if he ever wanted to go scorched earth, this thing would be over
Yeah,
tomorrow.
yeah. If he wanted to take an enormous amount of casualties, he could do it faster. Uh,
So
like
why doesn't
Stalin.
he? I guess that's the reason.
Because he understands that Russia has a certain level of population, unlike the communists who said, we could kill 30 million Russians and we can replace them in 25 years. Kind of. That was the communist attitude.
Hmm.
Putin understands that he has to maintain a popularity. He can't afford to absorb enormous casualties. So he's like the British in World War II, using artillery in place of manpower. And so
Okay.
taking it slow, he has the time, but he wants to keep this war popular. Yes, I do think if he wanted to take it over in the next 6 months, he could, and he might do take some of the stuff he needs to take in the next 6 months. But I think he looks at the situation. He's like, I'm trying to keep Russian casualties to a minimum and if that costs me an extra year, I'm willing to do that.
Do you think there's anything to the theory that Putin would actually, and just Russia, whoever is in charge in Russia, would prefer not to take Ukraine at all? That they want it as a buffer state
Oh
between them
yeah,
and
definitely.
Europe?
They would have loved to have it as a buffer state. If the
Yeah.
neutrality would be if they had just and they did the same thing with Georgia. I keep getting very annoyed by all these people like, well, we can't trust Putin. He's just a warmongering imperialist. And I'm like, in 2008, Georgia attacked Russia stupidly. It was kind
Yes.
of a trap.
Hmm.
The Russians definitely had more troops than they were supposed to. More peacekeepers than they were supposed to have there. And the Russians were at the gates of Tbilisi in 5 days. That's why the war is called the 5 Day War. And but once he had his concessions and treaty things, he didn't even ask them to recognize that Ossetia was part of Russia. He just said, just make them semi-autonomous regions. And he pulled his troops out of Georgia back to the starting lines. Like,
Yeah, and and when I heard that theory about that they actually prefer the buffer zones with
mm,
Georgia, Ukraine, and I thought, well, that makes sense because and I tried to think of an analogy with the United States. I thought like, let's say we had this long history of bloody land wars with Central America, that
right.
we would actually prefer Mexico be a buffer. We don't actually want to own them because then we're right up against the border of this,
Yeah.
you know, place we have all these wars with. But we have an area between. Like now we're safe as long as that area stays neutral.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
yeah.
Like
Okay, good. So I'm glad to know I'm not off out in left
yeah,
field,
no,
kind of
Eisenhower's
pondering
like,
that
if
thought.
NATO's around after 20 years after I'm retired from presidency, we have failed. Uh, he
Yeah.
wanted more states like Austria, where the Russians withdrew. And he wanted to have a line of neutral states dividing between France and the Soviet Union. And he didn't get it because other people had other ideas.
Hmm. Yeah.
But that's what we're looking at here when we're talking about Russia. So he would rather a self-governing Ukraine be neutral and not be racist. Unfortunately, a lot of this is about racism, and he would like another Belarus between him and Russia. Like, here's one. Have you ever heard of a movie? I think it's called By the Dawn's Early Light. Power
No.
Booth is in it. It's an HBO movie. You can find it on YouTube. It's very interesting. So it's about a limited nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Okay. Oh boy. All right.
Yeah, so I can't remember the name of the actor off the top of my head, but the US president is sleeping in a chair in the Oval Office. And suddenly he gets a phone call, and it's from NORAD. And the general saying, the Soviets have launched a limited nuclear strike against the United States of America. And the president's like, holy shit, what the hell do I do? And they're like, the general's like, we recommend a total retaliatory strike. And he's like, well, I want to speak to the Soviets to figure out what their demands are, what the hell they're thinking. And he calls up, actually, it's got some interesting moments before that. The conflict starts with a nuclear missile flying out of Turkey and hitting, of all places, the next city. And I just always remember one of the most chilling moments of my life is hearing this woman just scream in the background as the city is destroyed because she knows her life is going to be over in 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And so the president calls up and he's like, gets a teletype from the Soviet Union. And it's like, look, we had this situation. Some people try to launch a military coup here. We've put them down, but the missiles are in the air. So you have one of three options, Mr. President. You can just take it and we'll help you rebuild.
Yeah.
You can do unlimited nuclear strike against us, or in retaliation, or you can go to full blown and have this. And the president has 30 minutes to make the decision, and then he makes the limited war decision.
Yeah.
But if you put nuclear missiles in Ukraine, Putin doesn't have 30 minutes anymore. He has
No.
5 minutes. And so Putin is going to have to automate his defenses. We're going to rely on world stability on the accuracy of Russian computers. We
Yeah.
just made, if that happens, we have made Skynet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and my understanding is because like some of the Ukraine apologists are saying like, well, even if Ukraine was in NATO, they weren't going to put nuclear missiles there. But I'm quite certain that there was a classified material has been released that it was just a few days before the invasion. Kamala Harris was over at some summit, over there, and Tony Blinken was there as well, and
Mhm.
they basically said like, yes, we're trying to put bring Ukraine into NATO and to have missiles in there,
Yeah.
and that was what triggered Putin to finally like, okay,
Yeah,
that's
that
it,
was his.
going in.
I mean, he'd been prepping for a year. We know
Yeah.
that we saw the buildup. He made a bunch of strategic decisions on buying certain materials that were
Hmm.
critical for artillery shell production. He basically cornered the market on a couple of rare chemicals that are needed to make artillery shells and built up a stockpile of those and bought all the stuff that wasn't saved in NATO countries. So those weren't available for trade. But yeah, so he'd been prepping for a year after, I guess, after the Biden summit. He didn't think this was going to go well for him. But yeah, we know things about that. Yeah.
And my other, and this, like, I have a very superficial understanding of
Hmm.
Kremlin politics in general, and maybe a little bit more here, but
Yep.
my understanding is that Putin, in the context of Russia, is actually pretty moderate, and that
Yes.
one of the reasons, yeah, okay, because I think one of the reasons Prigozhin launched that coup in the summer of 2023
Oh
was
God.
like he was one of the hardliners, whatever
Yeah.
was up with that. So,
Oh God. I was attending that year. I attended two military industrial conferences, deep state types. The first one was the Canadian deep state, which was they kind of knew where things were going, but there are new capability in the Canadian military structure, and they were trying to tell our leadership what was going on, but couldn't really tell them because they were worried they'd all get fired. That was kind of the general attitude there. There was one guy from Australia, I believe, and he was like all in with me. I was like, dude, when they in every war game I ever played, when I've invaded another country and taken 20% of it, we consider that a win. What are these people talking about? uh, he's like, but I got it. These guys were trying to cover their ass and they didn't want to upset leadership. When I went to the US equivalent, these people believed incredibly delusional things, and the only thing I could think of that compared was Southerners in the 60s talking about black people when they were talking about Russians. I talked to a friend of mine and I said, Um, Merle, what makes you, we know in World War One, the Turks and the Austrian Hungarians had various voluntary mobilizations based on nationalism. Why are you assuming that's not happening in Russia? And he looked at me as I hit him in the face with a cod. It just never even occurred to him that there would be Russian nationalism. And
Yeah.
it's like, well, of course there's Russian nationalism.
Yeah.
Every country that goes to war has patriotic outbreaks. Like, why would you assume this is not happening?
Yeah, that's right. And no, I mean, and unfortunately, like there's a lot of hatred of the United States, over there that's going on right now. And I know a lot of that's, fallout from the Cold War, but like we've had 30 plus years to try to maybe build some bridges and have instead like just kind of kept poking the bear quite literally
Oh,
in this
literally,
case.
like
So
I remember, like I'm listening to Pierce Morgan talking about this stuff, and he's like, Putin's a dictator. There's no way he got 90% of the vote. Well, I'm like, no. First off, Dan, do you know who is the official opposition party in Russia right now?
no.
It's the Communist Party.
Okay. All right.
So if my choice as a Russian citizen is to vote for Putin or the commies, I'm going to vote for Putin.
That's right. And I also tell people who cite that, say, like, look, I've been told by credible people that it is impermissible to question the results of an election under any circumstances, lest you be an insurrectionist or something. So
Yeah, yeah.
clearly Putin got 88% of the vote or whatever it
Yeah, well,
was.
the other thing was like at the beginning of the war, we had a chance to differentiate the Russian people from Putin and make this Putin's war and not the Russian people's war. And what did we do? We went on the most massive cancellation
Yes.
campaign of our lifetime.
It was embarrassing to watch.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like there was a situation where there was a tree contest and they disqualified the Russian tree from participating in the contest. So I
This is like
feel,
base level ignorance that we're dealing with here right
yeah.
now. I mean,
So it was just like I feel that Putin got 88. And also in young democracies, we often see this where there will be a very popular leader who gets a lot of vote and support.
it's
Like,
yeah, 'cause in the antebellum United States,
mm,
like there was that period, like early 1800s or so, like
mm,
the Democratic hyphen Republican Party, the forerunner of today's
yeah,
Democratic Party, like won them almost all, mostly uncontested, until the Whigs started kind of getting their act together,
yeah,
a
yeah.
little
That's
further
a
on. And
very like we've seen this. Pilsudski in Poland got incredible numbers because he won the Battle of the Vistula. Napoleon III won like 69% of the vote and then declared himself emperor. Uh, Ataturk in Turkey was winning these incredible majorities all the time in a parliamentary system, literally until the day he died. So with Putin, I feel like those are the three kind of things. We often see this in young democracies. And the only thing that surprises me about Putin is that he hasn't just declared himself Tsar now.
yeah, that's right. Do like Xi in China and just like, yep, I'm it,
Yeah.
president for life.
I'm bringing back the Russian nobility and I'm going to start doling things out. And I think the only reason we're seeing that he isn't is that he was raised as a communist. So he just does not think that way.
Yeah, that's and regarding how slowly Putin has moved into Ukraine, I guess my question here is twofold. Do we think one possibility is he assessed the domestic political scene in the United States and felt like it was likely that Trump would return and he would
Mm,
have someone sane that he could talk
right.
to resolve this without escalating? And B, if that's true, where would we be right now if Kamala Harris had won in November?
I think we would have started seeing major cities start falling in Ukraine.
Really?
I think
Okay.
he would have taken Kharkov by now.
And
He would.
I guess
I
one
think he would be willing to take the casualties to accelerate to make a point.
and given that we've already, given that our weapons have been launched into Russia, which is a provocation never even done during the Cold War,
Right.
like, I've wondered, like, why has like a bomb not been dropped on London already just
Oh,
to make a statement?
he struck back. He closed the
Okay.
Suez Canal. with the
Okay. All
Houthis.
right.
They got advanced military weapons, and the Houthis were like someone the Saudis have been bombing for 8 years. The Saudis stopped bombing them, and they started getting advanced military equipment and defeated the U.S. Navy. They tried to run
Yeah.
the blockade with a couple destroyers and escorting a merchant ship, and they ran out of ammunition and they had to return back home to port. United States has lost significant military capabilities for the Navy over the last decade because of the focus on the war on terror. So you
Okay.
don't have the fleet auxiliary ships anymore to support. In fact, there's like 27 merchant marine auxiliary ships that have been sent to storage essentially because you couldn't get the sailors to man them anymore.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
So you don't have these fleet support ships like we would have seen in World War II available. In order to go, you have to, in order to send your ships out, you have to go back to a major fleet yard and get repaired because of all the problems with the U.S. Navy. Like British and American ships colliding with each other. You never would have heard that in the Cold War.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's and in a question sometimes you're like, say I'm in a church group where we regularly are praying for peace and
Mm,
very worried about this situation. And sometimes when Trump drops his interesting truth social posts, since
mm.
he's a president, people will get concerned because he'll say things. And he just dropped another one now, like if this war doesn't get settled soon, like I'm going to be sanctioning Russia and sanctioning. And I was kind of like, okay, Trump has to know he has to use his phrase. He has no cards here. Like if you're not willing to
Yeah,
escalate,
exactly. Like
he
he has.
he's not, and he knows that his political base that we are not. So he's got
Yeah.
no cards. Putin knows it. Trump knows Putin knows it.
Mm.
So like when I tell people what I see that is like Trump is just basically putting on a little bit of a face saving show
Oh yeah,
for
that
the
that's
neocon
entirely
war
what
hawks in the Senate and for another audience basically.
the resource deal was. It's just sort of like a fig leaf to say we got this concession on the Ukrainians of $500 billion, but I don't think he's. My understanding, the rare earths are all under Russian control, and
Okay.
Putin has offered to make a deal on those rare earths. He says, "I have no problem selling you these rare earths."
Well, that's kind of like getting me to like kind of like maybe we'll call phase two of our conversation here is
Okay.
moving forward out of this here is,
Mm,
so Putin's made that offer.
mm,
We're sitting down in Saudi Arabia having talking about a normalization of relations.
mm.
What does normalization look like?
I think Russia's in this interesting little place where they're between the US and China. Now, if Kamala had won, Russia would have to go all in on China. But Putin doesn't want that because he's going to have his population doesn't allow him to support that. Though the Chinese have been very conciliatory to Russia,
Mm-hmm.
there was a number of borders disputes. They actually had a little mini war in the 60s. And so Putin has wants to hedge his bets. That's the kind of guy he is. He wants to get back in good with the Americans because
Mm-hmm.
he wants the ability to play off China USA relations, like any good person in his position would want to do. So
Like we want to do the same with Russia and China. Yeah, you
yeah,
don't
yeah,
want everybody
exactly.
ganging up on you. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
like
or to be too dependent on one other great power. Yeah.
yeah. So he's making conciliatory gestures, like he said. I expect the four oblasts that he's currently annexed into Russia to stay into Russia. I think he can be flexible on some of the other territory. So if he just ends up with Kharkov and the rest of Ukraine goes, I mean, I think his ultimate objective under Kamala Harris would be to get Kharkov, uh, Neptorovsk, and Kiev as a
Okay.
possibility and get if he really wants Odessa, but he can let Odessa go. And thank God, because if he got Odessa, NATO would fall apart
Okay. All right. That's
because
interesting.
Odessa controls the mouth of the Danube River and would put Russia on the border of Hungary, and Hungary connects to Serbia. So that would
Okay.
be dagger right in the middle of that. And Hungary wants the EU. They've not given up their thing, but they're a small country in the middle of a big country, so they need support. And Serbia, and then Serbia is next to Hungary, so that would just be, like I said, a dagger into the heart of NATO.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right. And of course, interesting too. Like Hungary is, of course, right up there in that neighborhood, and they're
mm,
on Trump's side and wanting peace and wanting to talk to Putin.
yeah,
And the people of Romania clearly want peace because they're trying desperately to elect a somewhat Russian sympathetic president that they
yeah,
keep that the EU keeps arresting and throwing in jail, which is, and that's, of course, JD Vance highlighted that in his
yeah,
speech in Munich, and that's one of the other things that convinced me, like, these people in Europe are delusional. Well, not delusional, greed and hubris.
yeah,
They're down, bound and determined to go to war, that they will stop anybody on that,
mm,
that western border of Russia that's sympathetic to Putin, or I don't
mm,
even say sympathetic to Putin, just sympathetic to negotiations and getting
right,
this resolved. It's, yeah, so I just, and of course, these talks in Saudi Arabia right now, it's just, the world is very obviously changing right now,
yeah,
and the United States, and I always would, I argued in the run up to the election that, like, our choice is we will either elect a president who is capable of taking us into this new world, or we will elect a cackling moron who's going to be a front for everybody who's just trying to bilk as much as they can out of the old order before it finally collapses.
yeah,
And thankfully, we made the right choice.
yeah, definitely. I
So,
think Trump. A lot of people think Trump won the election when he got the shot in the ear, but I think he won the election when he was arrested in Georgia.
probably, yeah.
Yeah, I
I
think he
actually, I
got
even take it. I
more.
think I throw out an even bigger pivot point, and
Mm.
it would be when the train wreck in East Palestine in February of 2023,
Oh yeah,
and he took all those supplies up there. Because if you remember at that time, like, Ron DeSantis still had a puncher's chance in the
oh
Republican
yeah. He was
primary.
actually leading at one point.
I don't know if he was ever leading, but it was always close enough that to say,
Yeah,
like, hey, you're an underdog and you're going into Iowa. You're close enough that you have a shot.
yeah,
Like that moment in East Palestine, like, it felt like the political earth moved. Like, as you watch Trump rolling his trucks in there and he's like bringing the water off. And I remember just sitting there watching my TV set and thinking, like, this looks like the leader of the free world
right.
right now, like in exile, but the leader of the free world, like
Yeah,
operating here. And it changed. It certainly, the Republican primary certainly changed. And you're right, the mugshot in Georgia was, the lawfare was
yeah,
completely, game changing. That it just made many other Republicans. In fact, like, I know we have a friend who was like really weighing, Trump or DeSantis. I weighed it myself, quite a
mm,
bit. And like, as soon as, well, for her it was the Mar-a-Lago raid, so it was a little bit
yeah,
before
yeah.
that.
No,
But
and
the
the way
same premise, the
DeSantis screwed
lawfare.
that up.
So many people just said, like, all right, that's it. Like, whatever we think of other candidates, that's just gonna have to wait for 4 years.
Yeah, no,
We're
I agree. If DeSantis had handled that properly, he still would have had a shot. If he
yeah,
had just come out and surround, because they tipped him off that it was happening, uh,
probably, yeah,
he's like, okay, surround the place with state troopers. Rich said send in the National Guard. I would have surrounded it with state cops, a little
yeah,
less intimidating, and just say, when the FBI showed up, I'm like, we're arresting you for trespassing. Well, we're the FBI. We have a search warrant. Yeah, we think your IDs are fake. Come with us.
yeah. That's right.
That would
No,
have
that's
been,
right. But
yeah. And if he had done that, he would definitely have had a shot. But
yeah, that. My gosh, that would have been a very interesting dynamic to
yeah,
see how that might have unfolded.
mm,
But at any rate, like, we have a president that can actually engage with Putin and Xi at this vital hour when everything
right.
is being reshaped. So here's again my thesis and hope, and I'm looking for you to tell me if I'm not considering everything.
Yep.
I'm kind of like, just cut Europe loose. Like, they're being Islamicized. They're tyrants anyway. They they're basically vassal states. Just cut them loose, make a deal with Russia, and like, set that up as the new alliance moving forward. So I'm starting with the assumption I'm probably not thinking through everything, or I'm not aware of
Mm.
things. So what am I not considering there? And pushing forth an idea like, why is that a bad idea? So
I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea.
okay, all
We,
right,
we,
good.
I think we can save Britain, even
Okay.
though they're kind of overrun right now, but there's lots of people there who are still thinking like us, and I think we can. I do think what we're going to see over the next 20 to 50 years is that the return of the empires. There's certain countries that are going to have natural abilities to get to where they need to go. And they're going to start, I think we're going to see the breakup of the EU for certain.
Okay.
And certain countries are going to naturally return to their normal behavior. And we're going to see a bunch of border wars. I think this
Hmm.
Russia-Ukraine thing is just the start of a series of small-scale confrontations where people make adjustments on their border. And but
Mm. That
there is a
sounds
reason
frighteningly
why,
realistic. Yeah.
yeah. And the Muslim situation in Europe. Well, there is a reason why Europe has spent the last, not the last 50 years, but the 1150 years before that, kicking out Muslims.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's right. Because, well, like, I know in France, there's like huge areas that the police can't even go into,
right.
because they're Islamicized so thoroughly. And
England is not that bad yet.
yeah, yeah,
They have
and
a
there are pockets of my beloved Ireland that are
mm,
growing. Like, I
yeah,
got a buddy that's from over there, and like he regularly sends me like news stories of things. I mean, it's just in the cities and mainly even Dublin, not even Galway quite as much.
yeah.
But
I think England has a saving grace in the same way that Canada does because they did the smart thing. For every Muslim they imported, they brought a Hindu and a Sikh, and neither of those groups have very loving memories of their times under Muslim occupation.
yeah, okay, yeah.
And so England's a bit safer than, say, France, where they just brought in Muslims.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, like when the rape gangs were attacking English women, they were also apparently trying to prey on Sikh men or Sikh women, and the Sikhs would go find the Muslims and stab them.
Oh, really? Okay. All
Yeah.
right. So, yeah.
So there's a number of Sikh fathers who are currently languishing in English prison, but there was not this issue. Those gangs were not learned pretty quickly not to prey on Sikh girls.
Well, your description of this, very plausibly bleak future for Europe is kind of the answer to one of the questions that I have too. Is like,
Hmm.
is it possible for Europe collectively to ever really stand on its own again and be a true counterbalance to Russia and China, like without us, where we don't, you know, at least in the foreseeable future. I mean, it's
You know what? Looking back on the last 500 years of history, I will never ever look at Europe and say ever count them out. In 1932 Germany, the Weimar Republic is probably considered the most degenerate portion of the planet.
mm-hmm.
Hitler comes to power in 1933 and quickly turns that country into a place where they conquered nearly the entire world.
Yeah, that's yeah, because they were starving. I mean,
Yeah,
inflation was
yeah,
broken and
yep. So
had broken them. Yeah.
I know it's not a very good example of a turnaround, but that was in some ways a hell.
Well, actually, it
It
is a
was
good
led by
example.
a
I would
crazy
clarify. It's
man.
like it's not an edifying example because we know what their nefarious purpose this was,
Yeah.
but it is an It's absolutely an example. And
Hmm.
of course, I know one of the things that we talk about regularly on Sunday. Rich will talk about it on his shows. Is like we have to start being realists in foreign
Yeah.
policy. Like just because something is evil, like doesn't mean they're stupid or they're incompetent. And this infantileness in the United States, among leadership to talk that way,
Hmm.
to act like you can't respect someone. Like, I mean, I loathe President Xi. I mean, I'm a Catholic.
Yeah.
I'd be underground and persecuted if I lived in his country.
Exactly.
To tell me he's not an exceptionally talented leader is like to completely ignore reality. I mean, he's one of the
Hmm.
most diabolically brilliant men on
Yeah.
the planet. And like to not say that is to leave yourself completely incapable of acting in the world. And until
Mm.
Trump, that's who we had, running things. So
Yep.
yeah. So now let's look at our own hemisphere here, in the West. Of course, Trump's got these big ambitions in Greenland, wanting to, basically to make it a part of the United States. He wants you and I to be citizens. I suspect there's some trolling. That's more trolling than anything
Yeah,
with
I can
Trudeau.
see us have what would be much more sensible.
But where in Canada do you live, by the way?
I live in Hamilton, Ontario, which is
Okay,
close
so you're in
to
the center
Yellow Lake,
of
Ontario.
Canada.
You're in between Toronto and Buffalo, so I'm in the elbow there.
Okay, all right.
Canadian culture, I keep trying to explain this to Americans, is very anti-American.
Okay.
And like your philosophy is life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Canada is peace, order, and good government.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So we are a very different breed. Even though I sound like you, talk like you, have a similar accent, we are definitely not you. And Quebec is super not you. So
Yeah.
the idea that we would look, if you had us join your country, even as a state, you'd have two more Democrat senators,
Oh,
and
I know. Yeah, that's
yeah, like and a bunch of there. You would have some Republican congressmen, but we would tilt your country in the wrong way. We're definitely different. I can see an EU style, Schengen zone style situation between Canadians and Americans, where we can travel to your country without a passport. We can basically, like, I could get a job working in the States. An American girl could marry a Canadian without the 2 year process that is now.
sure, like the normal the without all the visas and everything that
Yeah, yeah,
go with
that
that. Yeah.
that I think would work better than being directly joining America. Even though your Articles of Confederation have a standing invite.
Okay. That's so like with Greenland, I assume Trump's focus there is about shipping routes and
Yeah,
ports and
shipping
everything. There
routes,
is that
military
right?
bases, stuff like that. Though does sound like he wants some to purchase it. I think he would like one of his legacies to be a Louisiana style purchase from Denmark. I do,
Wow.
I do think he might be serious about getting something like that done.
Yeah, I mean that really I like, and the fact that he brought it up in the state of the not the state, but the joint session
Yeah,
earlier this week to Congress, where he just said to Greenland, like, you can decide your own fate, but like we want you. And I'm like, wow, he's really like,
yeah,
this is not Trump just trolling people or anything.
yeah.
Like
No, this
he
is
wants this.
Canada. He's trolling Greenland. I think he would actually want to take on from the Danes. Could give them a good deal. They're
Yeah,
eh,
because no, yeah, he never trolls Greenland. He actually just says we want you and we want to protect you and everything.
Yeah.
So
Oh no, I think Greenland is a serious situation there.
and
In a way that the Canada thing is just a direct troll.
yeah, he's just going after Trudeau on that one. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's unfortunately, though Trump seemed to realize this yesterday in a Truth Social post. He's like, "Oh, the Canadians are going to use the Liberals are going to use my tariffs as a way to get reelected." And I'm like, "Yeah, you didn't think that before today?" Like, Jesus. But I don't think so. We have a playbook. We are going to the Liberals have, for some strange reason, decided they wanted Mark Carney, who has been living outside the country for 9 years and is the former Bank of Canada head and Bank of England head. And they've decided they want him to run as their to be prime minister for whatever, however long he's going to be. And he doesn't even have a seat in the parliament. So he'll be the leader without a seat, which is weird. It's happened before at the provincial level, but no, never at the federal level. And it's just like we're going to run the same playbook we ran against Michael and Nadia back in the day. You're like, he's a foreigner who doesn't live in this country, has no his loyalties are really to the UK or something like that. And also he's a banker. Like, do you really want this guy in charge? The guy has zero charisma, zero potential. He might. win a few more seats because of the tariffs, then he should rightly do so. But I still see us forming probably the biggest majority government ever in Canada.
Okay. Oh wow.
So,
And as we go north to Greenland again, so like the shipping routes are part of this. Resource wise, what does Greenland bring to the table? Because that's got to be a part of this thinking.
a lot of basin rights is very important. That's why Canadians invaded under the British in World War II.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
I'll have to double check that. I don't remember, but I think that was one of our like we just landed troops, took the place. Uh, Unlike the Azores, which is hilarious. So the British had the longest military alliance in the history of the world currently with Portugal. And they didn't activate it in World War II until the United States entered. And there's a series of islands off the coast of called the Azores that the Portuguese have. So a couple of divisions of American troops happen to arrive off of it in ships and boats, and they're ready to occupy it. And Churchill calls up Salazar, who's the dictator of Portugal, and says, "Yeah, we've activated the military alliance treaty of the 1492, blah blah blah." And then the guy's like, "Yeah, but these troops invade my. I understand that, and I understand the situation in the world, but these troops aren't British; they're American." And it's like, "Oh no, no, no! Don't you understand? They're part of our colonial possessions." And that was the fig leaf to get the Salazar to not attack Americans landing on his
Okay.
island. Like, no, no, no! They're just our colonial possession. I was like,
And my understanding is like Russia's also kind of messing around there as well in Greenland
yeah,
too.
they're
So
definitely building icebreakers. They definitely have nuclear subs operating off there. A lot of times I've heard that they finally had a sub equivalent to the Ohio class, which is very quiet, and they're just loved running across the U.S. coast with these things because they never had them during the Cold War. So that was kind of their shtick. Is like, yes, we finally matched the Americans on something. They
do
might
you think
call
it's
us
a
blue jeans, but we have these subs. So that seems to be the thing. But yeah, there's definitely competition in the North Atlantic, and that's really what this is all about: is securing the Western Hemisphere for America. Greenland, Alaska, of course, you already have that. Canada finally getting its act together, and Mexico stopping with all the killing of all those Americans with fentanyl. Canada's also committed, has allowed some fentanyl to flow through, mainly through bureaucratic incompetence, I think. I don't think there's any, like, unlike Mexico, might want to kill a lot of Americans just because, you invaded their country and stole a lot of their states. But
yeah.
uh, definitely that's the situation here. It's more there's a big scandal that was recently released in the media here where a lot of our border patrol people were arrested for corruption.
Oh, okay. All right. So
Okay, so
yeah.
that's a ongoing situation here. So it does look like we just allowed people to take bribes, and Trudeau didn't care. But I think that's when Pierre's in charge, they'll be all gone, and we'll be able to get things going here in Canada.
And then when you look at Russia's activities in the North
Mm.
Atlantic, one of the things when I'll try to think through like a resolution to the Ukraine situation,
Mm.
I'll kind of go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis of how JFK basically gave Khrushchev the face saving of saying like, okay, I'll pull the missiles out of Turkey, and I thought like,
That he intended to pull out anyway.
yeah, that's right. So I thought like, so like, what's Putin gonna give Trump just as like, look, so just so you can tell your people that I didn't take everything.
Yeah.
That could it be that Putin says like, look, I'll stop like whatever we're doing around Greenland and
Oh
you
yeah,
get
definitely.
out of like, is that a
Yeah.
plausible like deal there?
Oh yeah, there's definitely a deal to be made here. I don't think the Russians are really that big into Greenland or China is into Greenland
Yeah.
just yet, but that's a 20 to 30-year situation where they might well be in that kind of place. If I can totally see China striking a deal with Denmark over Greenland. So I do think that is a situation. The Russians have enough stuff up in the North Atlantic. They don't need Greenland. They got Murmansk, they got Archangel. So these are two important Russian cities that were used to supply in World War II that's where all when the British were sending convoys up to around Norway and were getting a lot of attacks, they were going to send supplies to Murmansk. So that was that situation. That's where I see that really happening. I don't see the Russians have enough. They have enough good bases. They don't need Greenland. Uh,
Okay.
China is much more likely the culprit in Greenland.
Okay. Yeah. So that's yeah. Because again, with the U.S. and Russia, it just kind of feels like we're just doing this big dance when really we're just right down to it is Putin's won the war and we just need a face saving way
Yeah, yeah,
to get
exactly.
out. So
That's what I feel the minerals deal is. I really don't think it's about minerals. I think it's actually about oil and gas. There's definitely oil and gas in Ukraine and a few other resources that are much more critical that are available in the country. Russia is also saying, "Hey, we have one of the world's largest supplies of these strategic materials, and we're willing to strike a deal. So if you recognize our territorial gains in Ukraine, you can have all this. We'll let you exploit these resources in Russia."
okay, all right,
Mm.
yeah, that's so basically, and this could be the answer to kind of really the final piece of my questions is because of course Zelensky's back and forth every day as to whether he's going to come back to the table with Trump or not. That and of course, like I want Trump to just sign the minerals deal with Putin. Like, is it an either or? Like, if we signed it with Zelensky, would that preclude some kind of a minerals deal with Putin, or can you like? Can the I didn't. It's not like it
Yeah, you
doesn't have.
can sign both deals at this point.
Okay, good. That's kind of what I thought, but I wanted to make
Yeah.
sure on that.
Yeah, you
So
can sign the two deals, and I think the one the Russians will get will be better, but you will get some money out of the oil fields in Ukraine. I don't know if they're that valuable, but there is some value there that you can't, and that he says it's 500 billion. I think it might be sounds like the British signed a deal for 100 billion. I think that's a bit more realistic, and
okay,
that's where you're looking at. And yeah, the European let's look at the European armies for a moment. So at the start of the war, Britain's army is about 80,000 troops. Russia invades, and the conservative government moves to downsize the British army down to 70,000 troops.
okay.
You're
They
trying to tell
downsized at the
me,
start of the war. Yeah,
yeah, you're trying to tell
yeah.
me Russia is going to roll over Western Europe and invade NATO, but you think it's a good idea that you're going to downsize your army.
Okay, it's almost like they expect us to do everything for them. So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
And Poland has an army of about 300,000. Russia's army is currently right now 1.5 million. So
mm-hmm.
they're partially mobilized for war. They will downsize that when this war is over. But they will have the most experienced army in the world at that point. The other one is France has 105,000 troops, including apparently the Paris Fire Brigade counts as troops for some reason. Germany has ostensibly 80,000 men. Uh, Ursula von der Leyen, I believe, was the name you're looking for earlier for the EU.
Yeah, Ursula. Yep, that's
Yeah,
right. For the
and
EU. Yeah.
yeah, so she was famous, infamous, and was later fired as the German Secretary of Defense because German troops were having couldn't go with rifles when do their training. They marched around with broomsticks, and yeah. So and then you got like there's a brigade here, and each one of the Baltic republics could field a brigade of maybe 4 to 5,000 men. So we're not dealing with a lot of like combat military power. It's mainly Poland is the only one that's going to have anything. The next great military power is actually Greece. They spend a lot of
Oh,
their
really?
military,
I would not have
mainly
guessed that.
because of their
Oh.
next door neighbor who invaded them, despite the both being members of NATO.
Yeah.
So they have apparently the largest, I think, tank army is in Greece. after Turkey, which is
Okay.
the bigger one, but Greece doesn't need as much. So there's that situation there, tension there, and Turkey has a lot of imperial ambitions in Syria right now, and it looks like they might have bitten more off than they could chew. But
Yeah, so I guess this is my real final question, and maybe
okay,
this is even the big one because it's kind of what I'm going to call the haunting question right now. Is you very well laid out like just how inept Europe's military is going to be. We've
hmm,
covered everything else about how much they seem to be pushing for war and how much Trump is trying to pull us out and do something new.
hmm.
Are we going to get a false flag event here in the next, this spring, where where Europe tries to trigger something that brings us into war?
Maybe, but we've had several instances where there was attempted false flags, and the situation was headed off the pass because the Russians
Okay.
kind of like said, "Dude, you don't want to do that."
Okay.
The most famous, infamous one is apparently Zelensky had this idea that he could drop a dirty bomb on Chernobyl of all places.
I remember hearing about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the Russian Secretary of Defense, and now they made big deal about when he got removed from that position, even though he got promoted to the head of the Russia Security Council. The Ministry of Defense is junior to the head of the or any member of the Security Council in Russia. So he called up every general in the States and Europe and said, "You do not want to do this. Putin will do something really, really bad in response," and forced them to back down from this really dumb idea. But when I heard it, I was like, yeah, this sounds so Ukrainian and so Zelensky because he's an actor. He thinks dramatically.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. There you go. That's
Yeah. So there might be some false flag, but I really don't think Trump's going to buy it. He's just going to be like, well, that's too bad.
yeah, and he's far enough down the road of distancing himself now. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, if they were going to do that, they would have had to do it like January 21st or something before a
Yeah.
lot of these events of the recent weeks have happened.
Yeah.
So,
No, I was watching, like I said, Piers Morgan the other day, and this was a different one. They actually had like some Ukrainians on from their parliament and a guy who fought there, and he's like, and this one woman was a Republican, and she was just like, "Look, your problem is not Donald Trump. You didn't lose. It's Donald Trump. He's just a reflection of the American people. You've lost the American people. We just don't care about you."
hmm that's
Like, and your international rules-based order, it's over. Like,
yeah.
yeah.
That's like I said earlier. It's like Kamala Harris was the attempt to just be a front for people who know it's over, but they're going to try to bilk it for as much as they can
Oh,
on the
yeah.
way out, and they don't care if it collapses because they personally will be fine.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
yeah. So okay, yeah, that covers like I mean I could probably we could probably go for several hours on
Oh, yeah, definitely.
everything in
But
the world, but that fundamentally covers the question of war between Russia and Europe at the
mm,
heart of it. Everything kind of that I had on my mind here. So
yeah. No. I was glad to inform and confirm many of your suspicions.
yeah, that's right. A few, like I said, a few of them I was kind of hoping to be wrong on. I was hoping you were going to say like, no, that's you're overreacting, but
No.
apparently not. So
No, I read the situation as well. Like I follow a
okay,
number of people like the Duran, Tom Luongo. These are great sources of information for people who want to know more about what's really
yeah,
going on.
I tell everybody like I know to listen to the Duran, especially because they cut up all their shows into the short clips where you can just
Right.
pick topics
Yeah.
and
Alexander McCurse is a bit too wordy, and Alex is, unfortunately, when I've discovered one of the reasons why I like to have a co-host when I'm doing a show is so that I just don't keep repeating myself, because that is something I've seen. And Tim Cass is another one who's guilty of that when he does his solo shows, where he just keeps repeating the same point. Like, I got it. Don't
Mhm.
need to keep repeating yourself. But
yeah,
when you're just yourself, you
you're
don't
right.
realize you're
It's
doing
hard.
it.
You need a check basically.
Yeah,
So
you need
yeah,
someone to
that's
check
right.
and keep
Yeah.
the make it a conversation instead of just a soliloquy. Only person who was good at those was Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to end it here. This has been a great episode, and I'm going to upload it later once I see. Oh, there's the stop button. Bye bye.